In construction, there's almost no point to trying to fight the market. You have to just empower the stakeholders, align with their existing behaviors, let them feel like they're being served, and then let them adopt. And at that point, we end up getting surprised, but really we shouldn't, at how fast technologies and businesses get adopted. But it needs that crucial bit of mindset change. Uh, but I think it's a theme which we find repeating over and over again.
Hey everyone, this is Prashant and I'll be your host for the VC10X podcast, and today we have Shubhankar Bhattacharya with us. Shubankar is a general partner at Foundamental, where they are investing in startups operating in the construction tech space. In this episode, we talk about what is construction tech, how is it different from PropTech, why productivity is low in construction, what they have learned from investing in companies like InfraMarket and Tul, construction being a major contributor of greenhouse gases, are 3D printed houses here to stay, Shubankar's biggest learning as a VC, and lots more. So without wasting any time, let's dive straight in. Hey Shub, so good to have you on the VC10X podcast. How are you doing?
Very well, Prashant. The pleasure is all mine. Looking forward to an engaging conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And looking forward to talk about all things construction tech. But before we get into that, can we first have your story and how you started investing?
Sure thing. I think if I go back 11 years, circa 2012, that was when I first decided to actually become an entrepreneur. So started a e-commerce website for diamonds and precious jewelry, gave it a go for a year and a half. Had a real tough time, I must admit, at it, right? Couldn't raise any outside capital, as ironic as that seems today. Eventually just ended up running it straight into the ground. And then, fast forward to mid 2014, kind of what was just figuring out what next to do in life. In plain speak, just sitting at home, like figuring out what next to do. At that time, my thought was to approach a few startups, look for the next role and join a startup, hopefully a fast growing one. One of the conversations that I ended up having was with a firm called K Capital. I even remember the very first time I spoke with them. I even told them, I have no idea why I'm talking to you. I don't consider myself an investor, have no background, no proficiency. Incredibly, what they told me is that they're looking for a failed entrepreneur. And that's actually how we got started. And I think eventually ended up joining them, stayed for almost 4 years. It was a lovely time. The highlight of my time was getting to lead the very first round in a company called Zetwork, which since then, of course, several people in the ecosystem recognize instantaneously almost, it seems. And along the way, I kept thinking what next to do, how to further my investing career. One idea I always had was to be part of a global setup, and that got me thinking on various possibilities on what to do next. That's when I ended up connecting with two guys who ended up being my co-founders and partners at Foundamental, and together we started on this journey called Foundamental. So our first fund, we kicked it off around the end of 2018. The second fund, it's the one we've been actively deploying out of. That's been live since January last year, and super excited and very glad to be on this journey.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I think failed founders are definitely a breed of founders that are definitely sought after, especially in the VC space. And can you like give us an insight into what's something different that you bring to table? Because there certainly is something that different that you're bringing to the table. Like there's a saying that goes that if you're winning, if you're succeeding all the time, your pitfalls or the things that go wrong, they're not recognized as much, or you don't realize that. But if you fail, like everything comes to the forefront. Is it that aspect, or is it something else?
I think that is definitely the case for sure, Prashant. I fully agree. I think what hits home very hard and in a very real way is because as a failed entrepreneur, you've given a lot, given everything perhaps to your venture, and to see it dying is a painful, a very traumatic experience. I think at some level, it helps you remember, stay grounded, that all of life, all of business, there's so much uncertainty, and therefore to never get ahead of yourself in in so many walks of life. I think whether we like it or not, or whether we admit it or not, I should say, especially in the early stages, VCs have a disproportionately favorable bargaining power. It isn't always the case, especially in a hype market cycle, but more often than not, we have a disproportionate advantage. And it's a reminder then that the tides can turn, and not to take anything for granted. At the end of even at the other table, there's a human being probably taking care of several other human beings, responsible for even more human beings' career. Important to remember that you're just dealing with people at the end of the day, and not to overcomplicate any temporary sense of power that you may have.
Absolutely. And I think this also brings in an important aspect of empathy that is so important, especially in the venture capital space, because you're dealing with startups day in and day out, and a lot of them are always going through ups and downs. And being an investor who has been through that journey and maybe seen the worst of it, you know what the founder is feeling like, and then you can be more empathetic in your approach, right? So that's definitely great. And while you were starting Foundamental, right? So at that point, was the focus still on construction tech, or has that thesis evolved over time? And if it was construction tech back then what was the insight that you had that made you focus on this area?
So the short answer is yes, it was indeed construction tech from day one, or even in fact before day one, because it was very much part of the process leading up to us securing funding from our investors and getting off the ground. I think if you speak with each of the three of us, that is my partners Adam, Patrick, and myself, you may get slightly different answers. I think one aspect where all three of us will probably have the same thing to say is, and I urge you to rewind back to 2017, 2018. There's hardly anything going on in terms of construction tech funding, right? And at that point, we sort of took a moment's pause and looked at it and thought, hey, construction in almost every major economy accounts for something in the ballpark of 10% of the GDP. And it's not even a rounding error in the amount of VC funding going in. That can't be the case forever and ever, right? So the big bet we took at the time was within 5 or 6 years, we'll see a mega correction and a secular rise, and almost like everything coming to parity, right? The big bet there was, right? The big risk there was it could have also taken 20 years for that to happen. So I think there we got quite lucky. We are very fortunate that things have turned and companies have emerged of the kind that some of whom we have been very grateful to be partnered with, who've kind of led the charge. And I guess, as a cliche goes, we're still only getting started in spite of all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the reason why maybe there are not so many VC funds that are focused on construction tech is I think mostly they are focused on software and things of that nature. And I know you had a conversation of that asset light versus asset heavy.
That's right.
On your podcast. Disagreed, right? Mm-hmm. So is it because of that we see that there are very few VC funds that are focused on industries like construction tech, despite the big amount of market share they have and the big TAM that they have, right? So what's your perspective on that?
I think, when we zoom out and look at it, the VC model is very much driven on the premise that if you present a beautiful piece of technology, a beautiful piece of a lovely business model that makes sense, it is possible to grow very, very fast or hack your way to rapidly gaining market share. And for the most part, especially in B2C use cases, many other more organized B2B use cases, a similar playbook does apply. I think what we have realized empirically over the last 5 years is in construction, and for a whole host of reasons, right? And it's quite difficult to just narrow down to one reason. There are various other things at play. And as weird as that might sound, a firm or a person will not switch over to a new piece of technology just because it happens to be, let's say, cool or nice, or something that seems somewhat superior, right? To give you an example, and perhaps an example that many of our viewers can relate to. So imagine, you've saved up to buy your dream home or to get your dream home constructed, right? Would you be willing to put down all of your savings behind, say, an unproven startup because they claim to be cool, somewhat better, right? Somewhat superior to the traditional solution? You might, and if that is the case, power to you, right? But more likely than not, you'll either choose to go the safe route or you'll do a ton of diligence, right? A ton of diligence to make sure you get that right. And similar things apply in, let's say, infrastructure, right? Ultimately, it's public money at play. And obviously, the moment something goes wrong, everyone is ready to give their commentary on why this should have happened or that should not have happened, and so on. And therefore, that leads to a very different kind of decision making, a different kind of pressure. So what we've realized is the opportunity exists, and actually there's enormous willingness to adopt, but it has to be done in a way which does not require any change in behavior or any difference change in the standard operating procedure. And that, for me personally, was something that needed quite a bit of unlearning and relearning for this industry. So many a times, I would actually encourage founders to not overcomplicate things, not try to think that a new way of doing business is a superior way of doing business, even if it might make sense on paper.
Right. Yeah, that's very interesting take. And like most VCs talk about disruption and doing and questioning the status quo. And I love this take that there are some established things that are already proven to be working, and you can just follow them and like build your business on the same lines as well, right? And like talking about construction tech, how big of an opportunity this is if we look at it as a sector, and how's it different from a similar kind of sector that's PropTech?
Okay. I think generally speaking, it's hard to get super precise numbers, but generally speaking, if you take just construction tech, in most economies, it would account for anywhere from 8 to 10% of the GDP. So on the current world economy size, that would come to anywhere between $7 and $9 trillion. Now, if you throw in a few adjacent aspects around infrastructure and everything that it takes to put that as well, it'll probably take the number up to as much as $12 trillion, right? Obviously, that includes the whole world. So I'm not pretending that every opportunity that chases construction tech chases a 12 trillion TAM. Although, believe me, we have got pitch decks of that sort, right? So it wouldn't be a first for me if someone puts that in their pitch deck. In our minds, I mean, look, I think a lot of people think prop tech and construction tech are interchangeable and synonymous. We think they're very different. They have a slight intersection, but quite different. So let me take a stab at explaining. So prop tech is more or less the technology or business model or innovation associated with managing or to deal with assets that are in place, right? Typically buildings that already exist, you manage them, or you sort of are in the process of handing them over, finishing them, operations of those buildings, and so on. Construction tech is everything that is needed to actually put the buildings or the assets in place, right? So the visible part, of course, is live construction projects, but there's so much stuff that happens beyond or outside of that site. Materials are constantly moving in and out of the site. There's design happening perhaps for months and years before anything starts. A whole lot of renovation happening as well to make the home habitable. And sometimes materials to be brought from very different parts of the country or even the world. And various pieces of technology to connect all of these things together. And in our opinion, the more you realize how far upstream and how spread out the scope of construction tech is, it's an incredibly large opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I saw it on your website that in comparison to other industries, let's say agriculture or retail or any other sector we take, the productivity in construction has been going down while it's going up in other sectors. So what do you think has been the reason behind this stagnation in productivity and innovation? Is it because of the lack of funding in the area, or why is it so stagnant? And are we seeing it change right now? Are there companies coming up trying to take that productivity upwards? If so, what do those companies look like?
I think the short answer for the latter is, at least from because you're asking us, we are obviously biased and drinking the Kool-Aid, so we have to say yes, and maybe we'll get into the complexion of some of these companies. I think there's various aspects going into why the productivity is decreasing. I think the methods employed in construction haven't changed in perhaps even 50, 60 years, by and large, right? It still remains very much labor driven, paper based, or extremely manual based. And in those kinds of methods, the more wages increase, you're kind of producing or getting the same output, even in nominal terms, not just in real terms, but even in nominal terms, while wages are increasing. Meanwhile, even the cost of goods keeps increasing, let's say assuming that they keep in line with inflation. And this makes the traditional way, the paper-based way, the extremely manual way, untenable beyond a certain point. And it could be argued it has been untenable maybe for at least a decade or two, right? Now, I think it is easy to turn around and say, hey, maybe VCs or other tech investors, growth investors should have put more money in construction. But it could also be argued, ultimately, we're not in it to incubate an entire industry, certainly not an industry the size of the construction market. I think it needed a bit of give and take, where certain companies show the promise that even though it seems like a fossilized traditional industry, that it has the ability to move and scale and adopt technology rapidly the way we have seen in other spaces. And I think the time has come, or it seems like it has come now for 2-3 years, if not more. And I think we're still not anywhere close to where the industry should be. And I think that's the exciting promise for us. In terms of your question on what some of these companies look like, I think what we see from our portfolio as well as elsewhere, it certainly seems to suggest that there's lots of innovation happening in the fields of procurement, where I think the innovation or the rate of adoption of new companies is the most visible, the most rapid. But extrapolating further, general supply chain solutions, the way in which design happens, imagining a new collaborative version of design, new alternatives to replacing fossil fuels in heating requirements for homes or for renovation, finding, and I use this tactfully, finding uses for robotics or autonomy in ways that are aligned with the market, right, to drive adoption. The distinction I want to call out is I'm not saying robotics and autonomy just in general. But I think there's lots of opportunity, and I think even more innovation, newer models will emerge. I'm very confident about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And one trend that we are seeing is 3D printing houses, right? So can you throw more light onto that model? Is that a long-term trend in future? Are we going to see most houses being 3D printed and shipped maybe in a day or in a week's time? That's it. But what's your perspective in it?
I think the jury's still very much out on that one, yet to see. I think we have a very high quality 3D printing company in our own portfolio called Mighty Buildings over in the US. But we also have other firms that are choosing to take a more modular approach to construction, which it could be interpreted that's another version of what construction looks like in the future. And even I think in a modular version of construction, you can have, there's several variations to that. For instance, you can have robots putting it together, which also, for example, one of our recent investments, it does exactly that. You can have panelized systems, which are like flat packed and shipped, even in a cross-border context, and just can be assembled even by the final consumer to put a home together. And those are also solutions we are seeing, right? Uh, we've also seen solutions where you almost have like an Infosys for construction approach, as in you can kind of outsource home building projects over to India, manage some of it through cross-border shipping, manage some of the quality and project management aspects from India. So I think there's various interpretations of what the future of home building looks like. What I visualize, given the sheer size of the market and the various the different adoption curves we see in different economies, different willingness to pay, I think where we'll settle at is for probably certain sections of the market will evolve or find equilibrium at a slightly more tech version of current home building methods. For example, of the lines along which our portfolio company Brick and Bolt is doing in India. Some will perhaps find a more organized digital developer or a digital contractor model, as in putting an entire ecosystem to assemble products and services together, which is an approach, for example, taken up by from O11H in Spain and Juno in the US. And some will perhaps be much more tech oriented, either adopting modular construction through robots or assembling panels or 3D printing the way Mighty Building does. It's a fascinating. I wish I could tell you with more clarity, but I think I'm just as excited to find out how this plays out.
Exactly. Yeah, it's very fascinating. And I just wonder, like, are these houses that are 3D built or built at one place and then shipped to another, are they just as sturdy as the buildings that are built at one place, digging in a foundation? Like, I'm just like thinking about that. Are they as strong? Can they stand the test of time, or are they maybe temporary structures?
That's a complex question to unpack and answer, because so even if what you could do, for instance, is you could prepare a raw structure off site, and then when you're actually putting it down on a foundation on site, you can then augment it further. But mind you, the downside to that approach is it could somewhat dilute the promise of 3D printing or offsite construction, because you're kind of merging the two worlds. You need to take care of a few other things from a structural integrity standpoint. And again, I must admit, this is again an area which is literally evolving in real time in terms of the suitability of these structures. Even it's still under evaluation, depending on where you choose to build, on-site, off-site, which material, how many levels you can even build up to, right? So I think even that, it's something which is kind of still yet to be finalized and still kind of getting, emerging as we speak, where the equilibrium lies there.
Yeah. So certainly something to watch out for. And construction is also a sector that's like responsible for close to 40% of greenhouse gases. That's huge, right? So what is the industry doing to like try to minimize that 40%? Because this is a legacy industry, things are done a certain way and it's hard to change that, right? So what kind of solutions can we expect to see there that help us bring down the greenhouse gases that come out of the industry?
Nice. I think our view, by the way, this our view on this is not very different from what we would probably say for any topic, which is, I think in each geography or market, we'll probably need to tailor the set of solutions we're looking for in response to the market needs. So what I mean by that is, I think in each major market, greenhouse gas emissions, etc., is an important theme, but how we deal with it, I think there's certain approaches which are aligned with the market behavior needs, certain approaches which are against it. For example, in India, what we feel the most direct way to address it to begin with is actually through supply chain solutions. Because keep in mind, if you actually just consume or waste 20% less resources, that by definition also means you'll have 20% less emissions. It doesn't always have to be that you incorporate something groundbreaking in your approach. You can simply just consume or waste less, right? And we think in emerging markets, that is probably the first wave of adoption, which we definitely see in quite a few of our portfolio companies. In economies like the Europe, where there is tremendous commentary around greenhouse gas emissions, obviously driven by many other topics, such as the dependency on fossil fuel imported from Russia and the geopolitical implications of that. So, what we try to do is also tackle problems from a timing perspective where we also think the impact, both in terms of adoption and financial value, will be the greatest. Therefore, we think, for example, starting about a year ago and even right now, going after uh, solutions that target the home heating requirements, where the fossil fuel dependency was and unfortunately still is very high, and replacing them with sustainable solutions will make a tremendous dent in the near to medium term on the fossil fuel dependency. And we have a couple of firms in Europe. I think one of them even recently announced a large Series A round. One called Enter, which previously was called Baupal, and another called Loon. Both of them are doing extremely well, growing very, very fast in the last year, both essentially trying to solve for, I guess, indirectly greenhouse gas emissions, but to be more specific on fossil fuel dependency in homes. Over in the US as well, we have gone after solutions where they're trying to index green materials or the associated carbon footprint of materials and enable selection of materials by clients, either developers or contractors. And I think the jury is still out on the extent to which we see adoption from these technologies. But yeah, I think we also believe greatly that there'll be a secular demand, but it'll across geographies, but the form it takes will be quite different. We, of course,
Right.
directly as well as indirectly also have seen new and innovative kinds of materials being developed. For example, zero carbon or negative carbon variants of cement, just as an example, which again, a couple of our companies are working on as well. So,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, that's great. It'll be like interesting to look how we come up with solutions in this as well. And let's talk about this one. So you have been an early investor in companies like InfraMarket and Tul. And these are like doing pretty well right now, raised hundreds of millions of dollars in fundings, right? So what's been your biggest learnings from backing these companies in terms of the kind of things you now look for when you're looking at new investments you're making?
So I think InfraMarket and Tool, both tremendous companies. Even if I were to extend this discussion to the next 10 companies, which we consider as to be the very best in our portfolio, and we are very fortunate and privileged that we are at this position right now. I think the learnings would not be very dissimilar from what I had shared earlier. I think we definitely look for founders with the founder market fit, but also the humility to know that in construction, there's almost no point to trying to fight the market. You have to just empower the stakeholders, align with their existing behaviors, let them feel like they're being served, and then let them adopt. And at that point, we end up getting surprised, but really we shouldn't, at how fast technologies and businesses get adopted. But it needs that crucial bit of mindset change. But I think it's a theme which we find repeating over and over again.
Right, absolutely. And while you're saying that you should be working with what's already there and not trying to disrupt, so I like for challenges that we're facing, like climate change, I think we'll need some disruptive innovations to fight that. Or will it still come through the existing stakeholders? What do you think?
That's a very interesting question.
Yeah.
I think I might have to pause a bit for that one.
Sure.
So my hunch here, I'm going out on a limb. I haven't thought of it for more than 30 seconds for the specific with this specific question. I think the point at which the two worlds converge, that is the objective of achieving or solving for climate change and aligning with what the existing stakeholders demand or want or behave, it's probably going to be driven by either regulatory or financial incentives, which is when the existing stakeholders will want to or be forced to do something and be desperate to do it because either they want the financial gains as a result of it, or really fear some sort of backlash. At that point, you just pander to them, frankly speaking. I know it sounds utterly ruthless and cold, but I would say, hey, if that's what they want, let them have it.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
my thinking.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good take. Yeah. Sounds good. Yeah. If there are regulations around it, you have to follow it, right? Regardless of what you want to do, right? Or if you're used to a certain way, right? All right. So coming on to my last main question for the day, and that's what's something that you've now learned as a VC that you wish you had learned at the beginning of your VC career?
So I think too many bad decisions happen because of groupthink and herd mentality. And it's
Okay.
even though connecting with people, soliciting opinions, getting intel is great, but there's a balancing act needed. At some point, you can also succumb to groupthink. And I
Right.
think lots of good deals are missed by well-meaning VCs because of groupthink, or too many bad deals are done by well-meaning VCs because of groupthink.
Okay. So at Fundamental, you're making decisions individually. That's what it's suggesting, right?
We try to, we certainly try
Mm-hmm.
to. Look,
Right.
groupthink, it's one of those very complex human biases which creep in the most indetectable of ways. I think we try our best to act independently, act off of our own conviction. I would like to believe we do fairly well, but I think the job's never done, and I think the objective is to maintain that degree of autonomy, that degree of our own source of truth, which cannot be tampered with through external influence.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, that's great. All right. Now let's move on to our rapid fire round, wherein I'll ask you 5 quick questions about the fund, and you have to give 5 quick answers. All right. So the first one is, what are the sectors and regions you invest in?
Sector is only one, which is construction tech, but regions is all over the world.
Great. And what's the typical stage of investment?
Can go as early as pre-seed and as late as Series B for our first check, and we follow on if we continue to like what the firm is doing for another 2 to 3 rounds.
Great. And what's the typical check size?
Our first check can be up to 3 million euros, and we can follow on with larger tickets in the next 2 or 3 rounds.
Great. And where can founders apply for funding in case there is a direct way?
You can reach out to any of us. We put our emails out there on our website. So feel free to write to us, reach out to us on LinkedIn. If you know any of the portfolio founders we have backed, by all means do consider asking them for referrals, because that I think helps us a lot, that you already are being vouched for by our portfolio founders.
Yeah, that's great. And last one, where can our listeners follow you?
So we do put out content on our LinkedIn page. You could also head to our website, which is Foundamental.com. And we do put various pieces of content, including our videocast series, although we haven't added a video in quite a while, but nevertheless, we do have a few episodes called Disagreed, that is dis/agreed, where my partner Patrick and I, we shoot the breeze on some things around construction tech.
Yeah. Yeah, I personally love the concept of the podcast where you've agreed to disagree on the podcast. And I think that's a great concept to run the show. And also love the insights that are shared there. So definitely go check that out. I'll try to put the link to that as well in the show notes, along with all the other links Shub just mentioned. Shub, thanks so much for giving me your time and sharing these insights on the podcast. I'm sure it's helpful for our listeners in getting an understanding of construction tech. What does the future look like? The impact on climate and so on. So thanks for coming on, and happy investing.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine. It was fabulous speaking with you, Prashant. Thanks, everyone,
Thank
for
you.
joining.
Pleasure.